What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my class rankings for Baldur's Gate 3. Now that the game has been out for a little while and I've been able to mess around with the full implementations of many of the classes, I thought this would be a fun video to make. That said, what I'm actually ranking these based on is a few different things. For starters, things like general power, how much I enjoy each class, and also their exact implementation in Baldur's Gate 3 specifically, because there are some classes on this list that are moved around specifically because I don't care for how individual things were implemented. To give an example of that, my favorite class, the Warlock, is actually not at the top of this list. I mean, it's pretty close, but still. However, in addition to that, right here at the beginning, I do want to stress that every single one of these classes is viable, especially on normal difficulty. This is a game that prioritizes role-playing over power gaming. The tactician build I personally made didn't even go all in on the min-maxing, and I was still able to beat tactician pretty handily. It really comes down to system knowledge and how things interact with each other, and because of that, these rankings are mostly just for fun and to express some of my personal opinions about these classes and their implementation. Every single one of them is capable of running through this game in a more than adequate fashion. So I would not let any ranking on this list dissuade you from playing the thing you want to play, because enjoying the thing you paid for is a lot more important than some random guy's ranking on the internet. So with that in mind, let's get into just that, my rankings of these classes. Starting from the bottom and working our way towards the top, we have the Druid. It kind of pains me personally to put the Druid on the bottom because I think they have so many things going for them that are interesting and that make them unique, like their wild shaping, all of their full spell casting. Some of their spells I really enjoy, like Spike Growth, and thematically they are such a cool class. The problem for me with Druids in this game is how they have been implemented in particular. I assume some of this comes down to technical limitations, but for instance, the wild shaping, where a Druid turns into various animals, does actually let you interact in the tabletop version with a variety of other class features so long as they aren't spells, basically. However, none of that is really here in Baldur's Gate 3. So you essentially turn into an animal that can take a couple of actions in combat, for instance, but even just beyond that, a lot of their mechanics are just very clunky in how they are handled in game here. For instance, Spore Druid sees us trying to deal extra damage when we have a temporary health boost from our spores active, but the second you lose that, you're dealing significantly less damage, and while you can raise zombies and stuff and it still has cool themes, that doesn't really jive with the fact that Druids aren't really frontliners. So it works, but it's a little weird, and because of that, if you just want to go like for pure effectiveness, you're essentially just building a spellcaster at that point, of which there are many. So while I do like this class, it's at the bottom just because a lot of it is handled so awkwardly. But admittedly, all of the various wild shapes you can get, one of which is a raptor even, are still really cool, so I do think it's still worth playing, however. Next up, we have the Ranger. The Ranger's at the bottom because it is, in my opinion, a little uninspired. Many of the things it tries to do, other classes just flat out do much better, or at least potentially can, such as attacking with finesse weapons, doing range damage, and because of that, whenever I want to do those things, I usually go to other classes for them. However, the Ranger still does have some things going for it that are really fun here. For instance, you can get an animal companion, which grows in power alongside you, which can help out with the action economy. There are a couple of subclasses that mix really well with other classes, such as Gloomstalker, that can let you set up some pretty brutal first-round combos. But Ranger is ultimately so close to the bottom because really just about the only time I even consider taking this class is for a very specific dip into it to make use of one of its features, with that pretty much being the extent of it, as it gets outshined by a lot of other classes in most other ways. Third up, however, we have the Rogue. The reason the Rogue is so close to the bottom here is purely due to the implementation of things like stealth in this game, alongside the sneak attack. So while I enjoy sneak attack, and with some of the Rogue subclasses it can be super useful, such as with Thief, getting the extra bonus action, or with Assassin, getting some useful abilities like being able to trigger advantage and thus sneak attack against enemies who haven't taken their turn, which meshes well with Gloomstalker, or Assassin's ability to start combat and then immediately replenish their action for another attack, can make them a lot of fun to play. However, I do think a lot of that is hampered by the fact that stealth in this game is more about cones of vision than anything else. You only really make a direct stealth roll if you get seen, and because of this, pretty much anyone is capable of sneaking in anything, which means that like one of the main reasons you would want to play a rogue is pretty much mitigated by other factors that are ultimately gameplay in nature. However, it still does a lot of fun, useful things here and there, such as expertise, making a fantastic person to help you pick your locks or disarm traps, and the fact that, again, sneak attack is just super fun to play around with, honestly. There are still a lot of reasons to play a rogue, but I do think their implementation in this game leaves a lot to be desired. Fourth on the list, we have the Monk. Generally considered one of the weaker 5e classes, with some changes, Larian has managed to make this pretty fun. Now, I will admit, actually, that my personal least favorite in 5e is actually the Monk overall, which is mostly down to things like class fantasy, but their implementation in Baldur's Gate 3 is pretty solid. They've seen a variety of reworks that I detailed in my Monk overview video that make them much more effective in combat, maybe a little too much so if you get down into the min-maxing of it. Monks are capable of dealing some incredible damage in this game, which can set you up for a variety of sort of ridiculous moments if you really lean into it, and it really feels like Larian went out of their way to give monks a lot of moments to shine, which is what it's doing about a third of the way up in the rankings, despite the fact that it is my least favorite class personally. That said though, moving on, we have the Barbarian up next. Barbarians are really fun in Baldur's Gate 3 for a variety of reasons, not least of which they're many unique conversation options that allow them to just intimidate things and provide a variety of fun outcomes that a Barbarian, as someone who's not typically a face character, doesn't usually get. So that's pretty cool by itself. And then there's just the fact that a Barbarian is pretty great melee, especially in the early game, with their rage and bonuses to hit making them a very solid, well-rounded damage dealer. I do think they get outclassed by the fighter in the later levels, but given their stronger class fantasy in my opinion, Barbarians are still really fun to play, and they are a relatively simple class at the same time, but with some of their subclasses allowing them to do really fun things like some incredible throwing damage, for instance, with improvised weapons even. There's a lot of opportunities for Barbarians to do fun things, which is why they're kind of in the middle of the pack. What really holds them back for me though is that they tend to be a bit one note. Moving on to number 6. Sort of dead middle here, we have the Cleric. Clerics have such a wide variety of ways to be approached and built, and because of their ability to select a deity, they have so many approaches to gameplay and role-playing that they can do so much for a party. I do think that they tend to get pigeonholed into being the healer many times, but realistically, in 5th edition, you don't need an active healer all the time. And what clerics are actually really good at in many cases is damage. As full spellcasters, they get access to a variety of very powerful spells, such as Flame Strike, Spirit Guardian, and that's just from their regular spell list, and then their domains that they pick for being a cleric also grant them a variety of spells which can be really strong. Tempest, being a personal favorite, provides a variety of large AoE storm-based spells that can deal great crowd control and damage, and some of their domains even allow them to be very great melee damage dealers, which makes them a great all-around class, which is perfect for being right in the middle. Next up, bringing us to the top half, however, we have the Wizard. I'm a big fan of the Wizard class overall. I think they get such a variety of approaches to spell casting that they can have a lot of really fun ways to be played. Now, my personal favorite is the good old-fashioned Blaster Caster, or the Evocation subclass Wizard, granting us access to a variety of death-dealing large AoE spells, while at the same time protecting our friends from them, as the Evocation subclass gets Sculpt spells, which keeps you from triggering AoEs. And if Larian's recent stats are to be believed, might be news some of you need to hear, because like 12% of all player deaths have been at the hands of friendly fire, specifically Gale. Gale is apparently the 7th highest leading cause of death for other players, and the Evocation subclass completely mitigates that. However, there are a lot of other really cool subclasses that allow you to lean into different types of magic, with the only real downside to wizards, in my opinion, being the fact that they have to prepare their spells as they know so many, and compared to a sorcerer's spontaneous casting and being able to use meta magic, they do feel a little less damage-oriented in combat at times, and that's kind of because they are, as they have a variety of utility spells at their disposal, which can also be incredibly useful. Overall, though, Wizard is a classic. Their implementation here is done quite well. They are very strong classes if you know how to play them, as they can deal immense damage in the right situations, but truth be told, that's the same for a lot of classes. Which brings us to number 5. For the 5th class, we have the Bard. Bards in 5th edition are your classic jack-of-all-trades, so to speak. They get a variety of skills, they can do melee combat, they are full spellcasters in this instance. And with their college subclasses, they can be incredibly good at a variety of other things as well. They also make a great face character. By the nature of the fact that they heavily lean into charisma, bards also get a ton of fantastic dialogue options. They also get the ability to perform out in the streets, which will earn you gold and can also serve as a distraction for the rest of your party. And stuff like that is really cool. So bards have a lot going for them in Baldur's Gate 3, and they're very good at pretty much all of them. Fourth on this list, though, we have the fighter. Fighters, I think, have a lot of potential for class fantasy and role-playing, as it's just general enough to give you a lot of leeway over what that means for your character, but also the fact that fighters are incredibly strong. With 3 attacks at a base by level 11, and then with Action Surge potentially 6, with Great Weapon Master you can take that a little farther even. Fighters are capable of dealing an immense amount of damage in combat simply by swinging their weapon, which is something even spellcasters can struggle to keep up with. So while they can be a little boring in their first few levels, by the end of the game, a properly built fighter is just destroying things. And with a variety of fun subclasses like Eldritch Knight, or my personal favorite Battle Master allowing a degree of battlefield control, you can do some really fun things with a fighter, which means they live up to exactly what they're good at, which is extremely reliable high damage, since they don't rely on things like spell slots or other resources to deal their damage. Third from the top, however, we have the Sorcerer. I, as I mentioned previously, enjoy a good blaster caster, and it doesn't get much better than the Sorcerer in that regard. Their main class feature is meta magic. They also learn some spells as they level up, of course, but they can cast all of them as opposed to having to prepare them, and they can use meta magic to enhance them. So while they won't know as much magic as something like a wizard, when it comes to dealing damage with said spells, their meta magic really puts them on the top of the heap in that regard, which makes them really, really fun. And also pretty easy to play. And thanks to their high charisma, they also make a really great face, which means that in a game like this, they're great at talking to people, they're great at dealing damage, and they have a really fun, unique class mechanic, which makes them a shoo-in for one of the top spots. In fact, one of the ways you could make a wizard slightly more interesting is by taking 2 levels of sorcerer and picking up some of their meta magic. But ultimately, if you just want to deal damage with a casting class, it doesn't get much better than sorcerer. Second from the top, however, we have the Warlock. Admittedly, my personal favorite class overall, but Warlocks are a ton of fun to play. They have a lot going on for them roleplay-wise. They are a charisma class, so again, they make a fantastic face character who can do all of your talking, and thanks to their mix of class features centered around both spellcasting and potentially melee-oriented things, you can either make this a Gish character, that is to say a melee and magical focused class that can deal fantastic damage in melee, but also be a proficient spellcaster. You can also turn them into a full spellcaster. They also get their unique pact magic, which makes sure even their weakest spells are always quite strong, and they even get the ability through their invocations to cast a lot of spells without using spell slots at all. Really, the only drawback for Warlocks for me in Baldur's Gate 3 is the fact that you are supposed to be able to use their Warlock spell slots to cast spells from other classes generally, which just doesn't work in Baldur's Gate 3. And while it's not necessarily make or break here, it is a little disappointing. Again, I assume this is probably some sort of technical limitation, or maybe it is just genuinely intentional, but in either case, that's really my only complaint about them here. Though last and certainly not least, we have the Paladin. Another classic, if you want to smite evil in the name of all that is just and good, a Paladin tends to be the go-to. They are a charisma class, which again, makes them great at talking to people, and they're also very strong mechanically, thanks to their class features of Divine Smite. This is why they're at the top of this list ultimately, because Divine Smite is incredibly effective in this campaign specifically, because Smite does increase damage to undead and fiends, and there are a lot of them in Baldur's Gate 3. And while Smite ultimately uses spell slots, so it is not infinite free damage or anything, it is pretty easy to combine Smite with a lot of other features to just do insane damage. There's also a lot of role-playing to be had around their oaths and either trying to keep them or deliberately breaking them to become an Oathbreaker Paladin instead. If you take a level or 2 in Cleric, you can even have a deity that you are serving, which has its own representation in dialogues. So because of this, even if you don't want to play a pure Paladin, a couple of levels in Paladin benefits all almost everyone, but especially melee characters thanks to Divine Smite, as well as some of their proficiencies. And while I would say many classes have them beat when it comes to doing AoE damage to a number of enemies at once, single target Paladins really steal the show, and combined with their ability to pass a lot of speech checks and things like that and dialogue and their role-playing aspects to it, Paladins really just steal the show in Baldur's Gate 3, which makes it no surprise to me that they are one of the most played classes, according to Larian themselves. That, though, has been my class rankings for Baldur's Gate 3. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's opinions about this, as I'm sure many people have a lot to say about it. But in all seriousness, I would be very interested to hear how everyone else is finding the classes, because even the ones I haven't really enjoyed that much, such as the Druid, are still classes with a strong class fantasy that are very capable of playing through the game. And as I said at the beginning, don't let any of these rankings dissuade you from playing the character you want to play, because all of them are very capable, especially if you're just playing on normal anyway. With that in mind, though, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.